ahead and commence. So thank you again. Welcome to everyone. We are happy that you're joining us today and appreciate you taking time from your busy lives and schedules. My name is Kimberly. I'm part of the QGIve team. And if you haven't had the opportunity to work with us before, we're an online fundraising platform that's dedicated to helping nonprofits raise more money. And part of how we do that is through webinars like this one. So today's webinar will be just about 45 minutes with a Q&A session to follow at the end, which keeps our total time together today to just about an hour. We will be recording the presentation and sending each of you a follow-up email, which will include a recording of today, as well as links to all of the resources that we discuss. So please be on the lookout for that in your email box in the next day or so. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please go ahead and put them in the questions box. Our presenter is ready to answer and discuss these during our Q&A portion at the end. And for those of you that are Twitter folks, we will be live tweeting today's webinar highlights at #QGiveWebinar. So please follow and join the discussion. Our username is QGive. After today's webinar, there is a survey, and we really would look forward to your taking that survey because your feedback is crucial in determining our content for future webinars like this one and other resources that we do develop throughout the year. Here at QGive, we do value relationships, and we're very proud to connect the nonprofits to our partner network and hope that this ultimately helps improve everyone's nonprofit effectiveness. So today we are excited to introduce you to one of our partners, the Alford Group, a professional consulting partner helping board leaders, organizational management, and community stakeholders improve the effectiveness of their mission-based not-for-profit organizations. For those of you, many of you that are working with QGive already and familiar with us, thank you. For those not, QGive does offer a comprehensive suite of powerful online fundraising tools to help you with everything from donation forms, event registration, text, fundraising, messaging, peer-to-peer, and auctions, and so much more. So we do look forward to together helping your nonprofit make smart and strategic digital fundraising decisions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our subject matter expert and speaker today, Karen Rotko-Wynn, Chief Business Enterprise Officer at the Alford Group. And as you will hear, Karen has extensive nonprofit and philanthropic experience and know-how. So over to you, Karen.
Well, thank you, Kimberly and Brendan and QGive for being such great partners. I have to say that many of my clients were able to utilize your amazing tools this past year when everything went virtual. And we're just delighted at the Alford Group to be partnering with QGive. So thank you so much. And I'm really happy to be here today. I'm going to pull up my slide deck now. And here we go. All righty, here we are. Well, it's something that we've all had to adapt to in terms of being able to meet with you and see the audience virtually, but we've gotten kind of adapt to it, and I know that you have as well. So, I'm really pleased to be here today to bring you the Giving USA data 2021. Giving USA is the oldest and most comprehensive report on charitable giving in the United States. It was started by the American Association of Fundraising Council in 1956, which is now the Giving Institute. It's published by the Giving USA Foundation, which is part of the Giving Institute, comprised of national firms such as the Alford Group and your host of this webinar, QGive. The Alford Group has been a member of the Institute and a significant donor to this research that is reflected in this report for over 30 years. The report is researched and written by the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and it's made possible by contributions from Giving Institute member firms, such as the Alford Group and QGive, foundations, and other donors. The annual report on philanthropy for the year 2020 has just been released, and I am so excited to share some key takeaways with this report with all of you today. This report reflects trends of total giving, economic trends, and trends in giving by source and recipient time. So this is what I'll be covering in the next 45 minutes. A little bit about what Giving USA is, which I started to tell you just now. Also, the 2020 contributions. So this report is for the year 2020, and I will share some information based on source and recipient type. The rates of change for giving over the last 2 years, also by source and recipient type. Trends in total giving, economic trends in giving, and trends in giving by source, and trends in giving by recipient type. Giving USA is celebrating 66 years in 2021. It's the longest running and most comprehensive authoritative report on charitable giving in the United States. It contains the estimates for sources of giving and amounts received by type. And this is important to realize. It is a big data project. It's 128 million households, 600,000 nonprofits, and 80,000 US foundations and businesses of all stages comprise the data that goes into this report. Now, many of you, I assume I don't know, out there in the virtual world. I spent the majority of my career before I joined the Alford Group in the arts. And so I think of myself as one of those sort of right brain, creative persons who, may not be so much of the data information person. But I have to tell you that this data really excites me. And I've been presenting this information now for about 20 years. I've been a consultant with the Alford Group for 20 years. I started presenting it every year for about the last 15 years. And every year, I have to say, my anticipation about this data grows, and I can't wait for it to come out. And when it finally does come out, then I say, oh my gosh, now I can't wait for next year, because we are reflecting back on 2020, which of course was an unprecedented year, but we're also now in the middle of 2021. So what I'll do today is I'm going to share the data from 2020, but keep in mind, this data really informs how you move forward as you're running your organizations into 2021 and beyond, and how you use your planning. Last year, when I presented this, of course, at this time, we were just in the throes of the pandemic, and the word pivot was used more than any other word. Well, I have to say that certainly happened. And as this data came out in 2020, about 2020, it was what we were thinking it might look like. But then, of course, this year, when we looked back in 2020, we were at the midst of the adjustments in our lives due to the pandemic and the social and racial injustice that had been escalated with the murder of George Floyd. We could already see at this time last year that 2020 was going to be an extraordinary year for philanthropy. So I'll start with the big picture. 2020 was an exceptional year and also an unprecedented year, full of challenge and uncertainty. And at the same time, as you know, there was a huge demand on the nonprofit sector. The environment for giving in 2020 was unprecedented in 3 areas. Number one, of course, the COVID pandemic, still unfolding, unlike any other crisis we have ever experienced. We look back on national disasters and international disasters as we look at this data every year. Never had we seen a crisis like this one of what we experienced last year. We still have restrictions in place, and so this is still unfolding. And then second, of course, the rise of the racial and social justice movements was big in 2020, and it was reflected in the charitable giving. And then, of course, the economic need. So then by the end of the year, on top of all of this, we experienced a strong, however uneven recovery economically.
Karen,
Yes.
I hate to interject. I think if your slides aren't progressing, we're still on the What is Giving USA slide, so I'm not sure if we're having a technical glitch.
Nope, I'm leading up to it.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Thank you. I'm glad my voice is okay. I was afraid you were going to say it was doing the Darth Vader thing. So if that happens and you say that, I'll know what it means. So I'm getting to the really big news. So, one of the things that, of course, was incredible at the end of last year was that at the end of it all, the S&P grew 16.3% in current dollars. So here we go. Here is the big news. The big news is that Americans of all backgrounds stepped up in their generosity, and all areas of giving led to an all-time high and a new record in charitable giving with $471.44 billion. This was up 5.1% in current dollars of around 450 billion in 2019. And if you adjust it for inflation, it was up by 3.8%. The number of charitable organizations in 2019 was 1.37 million, which at that time was a 2.9% increase over 2018. Total charitable giving has increased or stayed flat in current dollars every year since 1980, with the exception of the 3 years that saw declines, 87, 2008, and 2009. So one of the things that we look at every year is what is this total charitable giving reflected in over the last year. And as I look into these next slides, I'm going to be able to show you how this progressed over the last 40 years. But as I reflect on this past year, and before I get into that data, it really strikes me that despite all the challenges, so much innovation was demonstrated in the nonprofit sector. Nonprofits had to adapt to the way they operated, such as switching all of their events to virtual, holding remote donor visits via Zoom, etc. I mentioned the word pivot, and certainly organizations had to pivot to meet the demands of the organization, and those demands were multiple and they were complex. This next graph shows trends in giving between 1980 and 2020. I really like this graph because it shows you how the current dollars pair up against inflation-adjusted dollars. So if you look at the black dotted line, what was 48 billion in current dollars in 1980 is actually almost 153 billion if we were to compare it in today's dollars. And as you can see over the years, the trends of upward mobility, and of course, the incredible upswing in the late 90s. At that time, I had the privilege and honor to be working on a major capital campaign in Seattle to construct a new concert hall for Benaroya Hall. And I'll tell you something, the late 90s were a ride. There were so many transfers of Microsoft stock at that time during that campaign that I will never forget it. It was incredible. We raised something like 300 gifts from Microsofties who had become millionaires, who were joining the campaign with $25,000 gifts by donating their appreciated stock for which they'd paid about $5,000 for. So it was an incredible time when the dot-com industry, the tech industry, and everything took off. And of course, the Gates and many others like them were really stepping up. So there was a huge jump in the late 90s. And I remember the first time when I was looking at this, that we went up over 350 billion. We couldn't believe it. And then, of course, there was a dip during the recession in 2009, 8, 9, 10, that we'll never forget. And I'll show you in a minute that that doesn't necessarily reflect the stock market, but we did see a decline. And then, of course, now to the all-time high of $471 billion. So factors that I mentioned that influenced giving in 2020, well, the global pandemic certainly triggered the economic crisis. The racial and social justice efforts rocked the US in the summer. Personal increased by 7% over 2019, and the GDP declined 2.3% over 2019. So by the end of 2020, the S&P had grown by 16.3%. I really like this slide in particular because it shows total giving over the past 40 years, leading up to the $471.44 billion in 2020. The bars reflect inflation-adjusted dollars, and the dotted line reflects current dollars. And the green bars are the years that we experienced economic recessions. I've been raising money for a long time, and I actually remember most of these. And certainly the most recent one in 2007, 8, and 9 that we thought would never end, when we did see a dip in giving, but then look at the growth since we came out of that recession. Incredible growth, of course, to the unprecedented growth that we're seeing today. Research has found that there is a statistically significant correlation between changes in the total giving and the values on the S&P, the Standard & Poor's 500 index. Because the stock market values are an indicator of financial and economic security, households and corporations are likely to give more when the stock market is up. However, what I love about this graph is that you can see in the green bar, the S&P dropping significantly during those recession years, and giving, represented in the black dot, dropped slightly, but not nearly to the extent of the drop in the S&P. So that's really important to remember going forward. I hope we don't see another recession like we have in the past, but predictors are that it could happen. And if it does, don't despair. Giving might drop. What really happens, and those of you who lived through that, of course, know that what happens is that the confidence level drops. It makes it harder for us to get volunteers engaged because they don't want to be asked during those uncertain times. But never give up and always keep your donors close, and know that even if the stock market does take a dip, there might be a slight decline, but donors are constant and they are dedicated, and those core donors are the ones you want to keep close to you. What's interesting is that the S&P grew almost 15% in inflation-adjusted dollars between 19 and 20, and it was compared with an increase in current dollars of 16%. So I just really do like this slide a lot. This slide presents to you the total giving as a percentage of the gross domestic product, the GDP. What's really interesting about this is that it has remained at about 2% for the last 40 years. And so total giving as a percentage was at least 2% between 2012 and 2020. And in 2020, the GDP actually declined 2.3% over 2019, and corporate pre-tax profits decreased 3.5%. Both of these economic indicators are closely linked to corporate giving. And you'll see when I show the corporate giving slide that there was a decline in corporate giving in 2020. But I have to say, every year I look at this slide and I think, wouldn't it be great if we could just get this percentage up 1 point? Imagine if we could get this up to 3% of total giving of the GDP, what this would mean for charitable giving. I can't wait to see that at some point. All right, this is my very favorite slide. You will receive this slide as part of a summary deck. And I have to say, I love this slide so much because it shows you where the $471.44 billion came from in dollars. Okay, now, if you look at this closely, $324 billion from individuals, so that's 69%, that is outright charitable gifts. people writing checks, transferring stock, making cash contributions. And then, of course, you look at bequests, which is 9% of total giving at almost $42 billion. But then when you look at foundations, which comprise $88 billion or 19% of all giving, what's important to note is that half of that comes from either family foundations or individual foundations, individual family foundations. So if you take that half of the individuals who give through foundations, bequests, and individuals, that's 88% of all giving coming from people. Now, 4% of corporations still equates to almost $17 billion. That's a great amount of money. However, I love this slide because if you're working with a board that says, I think we should focus all of our efforts on corporate giving, pull this slide out and say, this is why we're building our major gifts program with individuals, because individuals are where it's at in terms of growing your philanthropy. And it is outright gifts, it's planned gifts, and it's people who are running family foundations. It's not to say you shouldn't still get your piece of the corporate pie or your grant-making foundations, but this is why we focus so much of our fundraising, both in capital campaigns and major gifts programs with individual giving. So if you ever need to use this slide, pull it out and remember that. So here's the upshot of it, right? The headlines, I should say. If you look at the big picture, giving by individuals was up 2.2%, not a lot, it's sort of nominal, and 1% inflation adjusted. The big takeaway here is foundation giving. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But foundations had a huge impact during our tumultuous year last year. It was up 17% and 15.6% in inflation adjusted. Giving by bequest was up 10.3% or 9 point adjusted by inflation. And it's important to remember that giving by bequest doesn't mean that those were gifts that were realized last year, where people actually passed last year, but they were gifts that had been promised probably 2 or 3 years before those estates were closed out. The one area, the only decline was corporations, who were more impacted by the downturn as corporate pre-tax profits declined. And as I mentioned earlier, the GDP declined by 2.3%, and corporate pre-tax profits declined by 3.5% in current dollars. So driven by these factors, giving by corporation did decline in those years. Okay, there we go. Now I'm going to show you the giving by sources in a little bit more detail. And again, what's great about this slide, these graphs, is that it gives you a nice snapshot of the last 40 years. Now, this information's been tracked since 1960, but 40 years is a pretty good amount of time to really look at the trends. So individual giving, of course, the steep incline in the late 90s, early 2000s, the dip in the early 2000s, and a significant growth before we hit the recession, and then up after that. What's interesting, of course, is that current dollars, $40 billion in 1980, in today's dollars would actually be worth $128 billion in inflation adjusted. So you can see how this has grown over time. And then, of course, what's interesting is that there are very large mega gifts, or gifts by individuals that require an adjustment to the econometric estimate, plus adjustments to the individual giving estimate from COVID-19 and racial justice giving, actually totaled $10 billion in 2020 is the estimate on that. It did decline considerably as a percentage of total giving over the last 40 years from 82% in the first 5-year period in 1981 to 70% in the last 5-year period in 2016. This next slide gives you a really great picture of foundations. And of course, as I mentioned, with my wonderful memory of my major capital campaign experience with the Seattle Symphony, we were in the throes of a major capital campaign at that time to raise $159 million to build a new concert hall in Seattle. And that just happened to coincide with the late 90s when foundation giving and individual giving and a lot of new wealth was being realized, and a lot of new philanthropy was also being enjoyed, which was very exciting. And so we see this growth in the late 90s, jumping from what would be about 18 billion in 95 up to about 37 billion in 2000. That was an incredible growth. And then, of course, coming out of the recession, if you look at where we dipped in 2010, before it started climbing again, we were at 49 billion in foundation giving, and it's now at 88 billion. So this is showing just the most incredible growth at such a rapid pace, due to the fact that it's been, the amount of new foundations, the charitable foundations that have been established, individuals who have contributed to their own foundations, and those foundations are outpouring into our wonderful nonprofits. And of course, this isn't just the mega foundations that we, of course, know about, but it's a lot of individuals who are also establishing their own personal foundations. This next slide shows you bequest giving. And of course, this one is going to go up and down. And frankly, it's because it depends on who passed away. And so there are years when there were significant spikes, when Joan Kroc left significant charitable dollars to public radio and into her gifts that she and the Salvation Army. It was an amazing amount. And so it spiked it that year, I think was the one that we see the big spike in the late 2000s. And then it drops because not the right people died, I guess, that year. So, but what is really, really important takeaway here is that it did capture about 7 to 9% of total giving over the last 40 years, and with its highest 5-year periods beginning in 96 and 2016. So this total amount includes estimated amounts for charitable bequests from estates with 5 million and above, estates with assets between 1 million and above, 1 million and 5 million, and estates of assets below 1 million. Now, here's what I really want you to take away from this, which is very interesting. Of course, the large estates, we would expect it to be a big number. It was 22 billion from estates of 5 million and above. Okay. And then for estates between 1 and 5 million, it was almost $9 billion. But here's the big takeaway. The estimated bequest giving from estates with assets below $1 million amounted to $11 billion. So what does that tell you when you stop and think about it? And this is what I love about this data. These are smaller donors. These aren't the ones who made the mega gifts throughout their lifetime. These are the donors who've been giving you $100, $500 every year for the last 15, 20 years. And when they pass away, if they leave you in their estate planning, they end up choosing maybe 3 or 4 charities that will receive their estate, which is usually their property and all of the savings of whatever they had left. So when you think about it, $11 billion from estates below $1 million, that is a significant number. That is a lot of donors who are doing that. So if you haven't started a planned giving program, this is the time to do it. Don't forget, this is really important. Okay, giving by corporations. Charitable giving by corporations did decrease, as I mentioned, by about 6% in 2020 from 2019, totaling $16.8 billion. So one thing that's important to know about corporations is that it's not just cash gifts that are coming from corporations. About half of all corporate giving is coming from in-kind gifts. So what's important to remember is that if you aren't thinking about other ways to ask corporations for money, think about what you can go to them for in-kind support, because half of this is coming from corporations. And as I mentioned, because the GDP decreased and corporate pre-tax profits decreased, that is reflected in the decrease in giving. So this slide just gives you a nice overview about how this has changed over the last 40 years, where you can see in the bars the comparison of the percentages. And of course, the light blue and foundations is where we see the biggest change in terms of the areas of growth in foundation giving between 1980 and 2020. And I like that this graph shows this to you in 5-year spans. So you can see this just incredible growth from the late 90s, sort of even, and then of course this amazing growth over the last 5 years. It's just incredible. And this is another way of looking at this in 5-year spans with individuals, foundations, bequests, and corporations in terms of the percentages of total giving. So you see 82% originally came from individuals over on the left bar of gray over here. And as it stayed pretty close to the upper to that. And then it started to decline to become now at 70% of all giving. But you can see that a lot of this percentage now is coming from foundations. So a lot of the individuals shifted their gifts into foundation giving, whereas bequests and corporations have remained pretty steady at around 4 to 5, 6% or in bequests. So these are areas where we can think about how we will be growing this. Okay, this is the another one of my favorite slides, the recipients. Where did the money go? And what's so interesting about this is that when I look at this slide and I see 28% going to religion, when I first started looking at this data about 20 years ago, and for quite some time, that was always 50% of total charitable giving. Well, the dollars have not decreased, but the percentage has, because the percentages of other recipients of contributions has increased. They've gotten more sophisticated in their fundraising. A lot of donors who might have been giving through religious causes are giving directly to human services or directly to individuals or directly to international affairs. And so that's why we see this shift in this opportunity here. But what's super exciting and interesting for me is that, as I said, religion continues to receive the largest share, but then the education subsector received the second largest portion in 2020 at 15%. And human resources was an increase of 9.7% over 2019. And of course, that is very much in line with pandemic-related giving in 2020. Next in line is giving to grant-making foundations, which includes independent, community operating foundations, which represents the fourth biggest share. And the fifth largest portion is public society benefit, receiving 10%. And then health is actually now in sixth place, receiving 9%, which actually was a decrease between 2019 and 20. International affairs ranked seventh, amounting to 5%. And arts and culture and humanities were the eighth largest portion, or at 4%, which was a decrease over the previous year. This next slide shows you that in 7 of the 9 subsectors, there were increases of more than 8% in all of those 7 subsectors. And for 5 of them, education, human services, public society, international affairs, environment, was more than an 8% increase in those. What's amazing is that the 2-year growth, and I'll show you that in a moment, was positive for all 9, even though we saw the dip in health and arts and culture. And of course, arts and culture was impacted by the shutdowns over the past year, the inability to host the in-person events, performances were shut down, and a lot of that was really impacted in arts and culture. What's interesting too is the types of recipient organizations that typically see declines, such as arts and culture, also saw decreases in 2020. This shows you that, as I mentioned, if you look at 2-year spans of all of these subsectors, even though we had those decreases in health and arts in 2020, the 2-year cumulative is an increase in all. But look at the the big ones, of course: public society benefit, foundations, education, environment, and animals. So interesting to me to see those increases. So I'm going to go into a little bit about these sectors here, and keep an eye on the time, so we have some time for questions. Giving to religion is 28% of all gifts received. It increased by 1% over 2020, and it totaled the fourth highest inflation adjusted amount recorded to date. According to the Blackbaud Institute, online giving to its sample of faith-based organizations increased almost 27% between 2019 and 2020. And online giving comprised 17% of total giving for these organizations, which is very interesting. Now, what's notable about giving to religion, and this question always comes up, so I'll address it now, is that the religious giving is made up of giving to houses of worship, denominational groups, religious media, religious organizations that are exempt entities. What's important to remember is organizations such as World Vision or Compassion, giving to those shows up in international. And so that doesn't capture all of the religiously motivated giving in international giving. And then religious university giving shows up under education. But what's important, I think, still, and statistics are interesting about this, is that 75% of all giving in America is religiously motivated. So many have started as faith-based organizations, such as the YMCA, with strong roots in religion, and have shifted more to social services. So that's important to remember, that when I talked about religion being 50% of the pie, that it really has changed there. So in terms of where the dollars are going, but not in terms of the motivation. Giving to education amounted to 15%, and contributions grew by 9% over 2019. They totaled the highest inflation-adjusted value recorded to date. Look at this jump between 2015 and 2020. I mean, you can see that for 15 years, it was hovering around 50 billion, and it jumped up over the last 5 years to 71 billion. And again, we're looking at current dollars in black and the inflation-adjusted dollars in green. So I just look at the green because that's apples to apples. Giving to human services was 14% of all donations received by charities in 2020. It grew by 9%, totaling $65.14 billion. In 2020, it totaled the highest inflation-adjusted amount recorded to date. And again, human services analyzed by Blackbaud Institute saw almost 46% increase in online giving between 2019 and 2020. So again, online giving was a huge factor in 2020. Giving to foundations amounted to 12% and totaled up to reached $58 billion in 2020. And the estimate includes gifts made to independent, community, and operating foundations. So it reached its highest inflation value ever recorded to date. And then we look at the health subsector. It's interesting that this actually showed a decline in 2020. It declined by 3%, and it tied for the second highest inflation value recorded to date. And again, the research is showing that between 19 and 20, the online contributions increased by 11%. Again, online contributions. Next, public society benefit amounted to 10%, reaching $48 billion. These organizations are organizations that serve a multiple of purposes. It includes gifts to donor advised funds, and many households are setting up these funds and gifts to deaths. Public society benefit includes organizations that are like United Ways, Jewish Federation funds, and that kind of organization. And again, increase of this is incredible in terms of the other research reported by M&R and NTEN. Online revenue to hunger and poverty relief organizations increased 173%. So there was a lot of giving in this subsector during COVID and during our crisis last year. And then, of course, near and dear to my heart, the arts and culture. I've watched this one for a long time. Actually, this entire 40-year span, I've watched arts and culture. So it did dip in 2020. And what's also interesting is that the online giving to arts increased by 7%, far outpacing giving through many other traditional methods. So, as I started earlier in talking about pivoting, the word pivot was used very widely by arts and culture, and many, as I mentioned, my arts and culture clients, in fact, was able to benefit from the services that QGive provides in terms of going to online events. They quickly pivoted to move to online activities. What's interesting now is starting to develop hybrid options, but there's still the challenges to fine-tune the models to engage their supporters. On the bright side of the arts, we heard that many actually were able to make it through and reach more people through virtual events, and were able to build new communities and engage more donors than they did before. Some arts organizations are actually in a stronger financial position now than they were before, which is fascinating. So how do we take, especially in the arts, these lessons learned in this last year to continue to promote more equity and more access to the arts, and include and continue to include and engage those new donors and audience members who joined you virtually? International affairs is 5% of all of the donations, and it is organizations that also saw an increase of 7% in online giving between 2019 and 2020. And environment animals grew by 3%. Again, this is actually a sector that wasn't even being tracked before the mid 90s. As you can see, we don't even see it coming onto our radar until then, because it was not tracked. It wasn't a subsector that was as active as it became. And look at the growth in terms of coming onto the stage and seeing significant growth up to 11 billion by 2015, and then incredible awareness about environment and animals, animal welfare. This has been a huge growth. And of course, again, having worked with animal welfare organizations, I can tell you that they do receive wonderful surprises in bequest giving. And so that's an area to always keep an eye on and think about here. And so this is just a couple more slides to show you some visuals on percentages of total, again, in 5-year spans over these last 40 years. So you can see how these subsectors have changed. You can see in the dark gold that, religion was more than 50% up until like the early 90s. And then as the percentage dropped, you see other percentages coming onto the stage here in terms of health and international affairs and of course, just, how that has grown over time. And then if you look at the recipients, the total giving, this is probably a little bit harder to see, but again, just looking at this growth in 5-year spans of 712 billion up to where we are today. This is also great, as we look at the number of 501c3 organizations in our universe, they're over the last just 10 years. We saw the drop in 2011, not because what happened was the tax law changed, and the requirement was that all organizations of all sizes had to file. So previously it was only over a certain amount. And so a lot of those organizations no longer existed. And so it was the more accurate account in 2011 of where we really were at about 1 million nonprofits, which has now increased to 1.365744 million nonprofits in the United States. So there's a bit of competition out there. It's a good number to keep in mind. So looking forward, want to save some time for questions. These are my takeaways here. Keep your core donors and newly acquired donors close. Stay and closely communicate. You can't get it across enough. Communicate. So much happened last year where new donors came in. Donors that have been with you really stepped up. Don't let it slide. We have to change those statistics about returning donors. It has to improve, and it requires due diligence and a lot of work in stewardship. And if you don't have a planned giving program, it's a good idea to start one now. Remember, 11 billion in bequests came from estates below $1 million. Focus on individual major gifts. The strong stock market really provides opportunities for us right now for your donors and your organizations. There's a lot of wealth out there. There's a lot of appreciated stock, and it's an opportunity for your organization. It's an opportunity for a donor to make a significant gift by transferring an appreciated stock and making a significant gift to you and saving on the appreciated on the tax that they would pay on the capital gains. Utilize this data to benchmark against your own organization. How do you fare amongst the breakdown of all of the sources of giving? Do this exercise for your own organization and think about it as you make your plans for the remainder of this year and into 2022. Think about what you've learned today to set the stage for the environment to strengthen your reach to a broader community of supporters. How can you do that? So I want to thank you so much. The Giving USA annual report is available to order online through givingusa.org. And if you actually send me an email, that you'll get a summary slide from Kimberly. You can send me an email. I'll send you a discount code to give you a 30% discount on the products. And again, the Alford Group is so pleased to be here partnering with QGive. We hope to be your valued partner with your fundraising, strategic planning, and a variety of services that we provide to the nonprofit sector. Back to you, Kimberly.
Well, thank you. Gosh, that was some incredibly eye-opening numbers. I had no idea. So Karen, thank you. We do have a few questions for you, so hopefully you're ready. Alana would like to know, where do city, state, and federal government grants fit in the chart with giving by source?
Great question, Alana. I'm so glad you asked it because it always comes up, and I need to clarify that this report is only charitable giving. So this is only philanthropic giving. That's what we're tracking with Giving USA. City, state, and county is all public funding. And depending on your funding model at your organization, you may actually be receiving 60, 70, 90% of your funds from public sources, government sources. So think about how you can grow your piece of the overall pie with the philanthropic giving. So and that's where you see a lot of growth in charitable giving with human services, because over the years, the government support has decreased. And so we saw a lot of human services organizations. In fact, our firm actually works with more human service and social service organizations than any other sector, because it is still a sector where there are so many nonprofits and who are needing to realizing that they can't rely as much on those public funds as they used to. And so this is just charitable dollars. And the other thing, I'll stop. I could keep going, but I won't. But last year, of course, there was a lot of help through government funds, the PPP loans, government grant loans through that were forgiven, other kinds of government grants. That's not included in this. These are the foundations and the individuals who contributed to the nonprofits last year.
So a follow-up real quick from Alana, and then I'll go to your next question. She's asking, where can she find stats on public giving? I think depending on which state you're in, you can go to your state. So I know in the state of Washington, you can, I could tell you off the top of my head where to go in the state of Washington. I think it varies from state to state and city to city. And so go to your state, look for granting opportunities through the state, see if they have done some scenarios on total giving. I think some of that information will come out, but that's not information that's provided through the Giving Institute. So we would have to go and look for that in other through other sources. Okay, well, thank you, Karen. Following up a little bit on what you were just talking about, Drew had a question asking if you could delineate between the health and human services, the differences.
So health organizations are hospital foundations, right? We often say health and human services. So let me back up for a second. There's giving to health. The health subsector are hospitals or healthcare facilities that have foundations. When we use, I'm glad you asked this, because we talk about health and human services kind of in one bowl here, because so many of the social services are providing mental health, physical health, along with helping with feeding people and providing shelters for people who are homeless or abused. And so it all gets kind of wrapped into human services. So when we see that huge growth in human services in 2020, it really is directly attributed to people giving to organizations that are helping people in need. The people who are homeless, the people who are having mental illness, the people. So it's not going to a health nonprofit, but it's going to a human services nonprofit that is also addressing health concerns of individuals. I hope that.
I think so. And I think you also actually answered a question that Renee had asked. Just double checking, it looks as if health decreased in giving. How can you further elaborate on this, considering health was such an area of concern during 2020? Does the category include mental health? So I think you covered that too.
Well, what's interesting though about health declining is that the folks who were giving to COVID relief were giving to education, human service, and environment animals, which is interesting, not to the actual hospital foundations. So that was something I think that surprised people. It's like, why isn't health of a year in COVID, but the donors were giving directly to the human services and to education. And that for COVID relief in other ways,
Gotcha.
helping
Well,
students, helping people in need. Yeah.
we have a switching sector here. We have a question from Michael about where does giving to religious colleges and schools go?
Michael, that is a great question. If it is a religious school or college, it's actually going to education. So that is a good question. And that's why, as I mentioned, the giving to religious motivated organizations doesn't necessarily mean giving to a religiously run organization. So in this case, it's classified as education giving.
Gotcha. I think we have time for one last question. So what are you hearing from organizations that you're working with about what they're going to do with regards to virtual events when people start wanting to get back together in person?
Great question. This is a year of discovery, isn't it? I know everyone is going through this. And as I'm talking with both foundation representatives and also on leaders of nonprofit organizations, they are really looking at how 2021 is going to be a year to figure out a way to have a hybrid of activities going on. People are still operating virtually for the most part. And so I'm anticipating, especially with the arts, that they're probably going to start doing, as they start to come back into opening up their doors for performances again, they may go back to some traditional ways of holding their events in person, but I think that they are also going to have some hybrid models in place where they continue to provide content and arts and events online, because they have found that the people coming to their online events are coming from all over the country. And they never would have come if it had only been in their theater that night. They're finding that 3 times the number of people came to their virtual event. So this is the time to really look at who those people are, stay in touch, communicate, and come up with a plan about how to keep them engaged as you move more into in-person. And I honestly think that I could go on in terms of all scenarios, but I know with some of the organizations I'm working with, they're really looking right now at how do they manage their board meetings, because they're finding that as the board meetings have been virtual over the last year, they are having 100% attendance. So the boards are grappling with, okay, do we meet in person 3 times a year and do the rest of them on Zoom? Or do we continue on Zoom, or do we go back in person? You just have to poll your group, find out what they want, but also think about the things we've learned in terms of engagement on Zoom this past year, and the really good things about it that have worked, and how can we continue to hang on to it.
Well, I agree. I think everything that you said is a lot of the trends that we're seeing here at QGIVE too, with the things that we're working on. So thank you again, Karen. That was some incredible information. Thanks to all of you still on the line with us at the moment. We will be emailing you a copy of today's recording, as well as links to a summary deck and the offer that Karen had mentioned. So if you would like to reach out to the QGIVE team with any questions, or the Alford Group team, the contact information will be on this last slide of the presentation. Please don't forget to take the survey, and we hope that everything we covered today really will help you understand that integral relationship and the data and how it helps your fundraising. So thanks again, and we'll be in touch. Have a great one.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.